Today's video, we're going to talk about the heart of your workshop, your table saw. And what I have is a DeWalt contractor saw right here in my workbench, and in many ways it is perfect for my woodworking needs. But today, I aim to combat its greatest weakness. And I'm going to do it as cheaply as possible in a way that anybody can replicate. I'll also show you how many times I went wrong in this build and how I made loads of small improvements to the final design. But very quickly, table saw weaknesses. For what I build, it isn't the power, the tabletop size, or the noise of these things. For me, the biggest weakness of a contractor's saw like this one is the length of the fence, especially for a beginner. So I did a little research and I found this. How much? It's the fantastic acting that brings you back, isn't it? Now I'm sure that this extension fence is an amazing bit of kit, but I can't justify that kind of money for something that is only going to help me with a very small percentage of the actual cuts I do. And it really is just a small percentage of your cuts. We'll come back to that one in a second. But first, let me show you what I've built while also talking to you about the aim. And of course, all of the mistakes I've made along the way. And honestly, there are so many. But showing will mean you can avoid them. 18mm ply was my material choice. My design was 2 outer skins joined in a tension box fashion to ensure a nice flat surface to run your boards along. And that reminds me, just to finish up the explanation as to why I'm doing this, and why I can't justify the bow extension itself. You see, it's nothing to do with quality because I guarantee that extension will be lighter, more accurate and more versatile than the one I'm going to make today. But hear me out, because you don't need these extensions for crosscuts or for smaller rip cuts. Its sole purpose is for those longer rip cuts. So let's assume really only 20% of your total cuts that you'll do on your table saw, maybe. It's really going to be for things like breaking down plywood into its final dimensions for building cabinets or jigs, and things of that nature. So that's really why I'm doing the build. Now, for the how. My first design had the fence high enough to take the bow featherboard, not through any affiliation, but just because that's what I happen to be using at the moment. And I really like it. These are in place just to hold the board down to your tabletop and reduce the risk of kickback. Spacing the internal brackets equally was my idea for bringing the two sides into a parallel box, therefore ensuring that the fence would be perfectly straight and flat. Now, I have to come clean with you right away. You will see a finished fence extension that works absolutely perfectly. But this one isn't it. You see, I needed to fail in order to be able to bring this right in the end. You'll see. See, at first I had this genius idea that I would attach the support piece to the back of the fence using a T-track. You know, so you have the full versatility of being able to slide it close to the table saw if needed. And then I made the support itself, yet more 18mm ply, as if the fence wasn't already heavy enough. And please bear in mind, I am planning on attaching this to the existing table saw fence. I'm sure there are already plenty of you shouting at your screen right now, saying things like, that fence will never take all that weight, and why are you making the extension long enough to reach the door of your workshop? Don't worry, I hear you. Well, now I do, but at the time I was still pressing on, blind. And this is important. You can't always get it right first time. If you think you have an idea good enough, just go with it. But here's the advice that I didn't heed. You have to know when to stop, when to leave an idea as a bad experiment. And most importantly, when to just suck it up and buy the item that you were trying to replicate. One thing I haven't mentioned is case number 3. Case number 3 is when you should stop, but not give up, and just give it one more try, but with a little bit of thought first. To know what I needed to adapt to make this succeed, I took mark number 1 over to the table saw to give it a test. And for just 1 second, I thought that I cracked it because I'd got the vertical perfectly square. But that was short-lived, as there was a number of issues. It's too heavy. It's way too long. And yes, it's not even close to being straight. So I did what any sensible woodworker would do. I made a second. But do you think that I followed rule number 3? No. Do you think that I genuinely assessed all of my errors? No, of course not. This is mark number 2, compared to mark number 1. I did shorten the design as the weight was a very obvious issue, but everything else about the design was pretty much the same. And with that, so were the failings. Or at least the main failing that absolutely can't be overlooked. The Mark II fence was far from straight. 2 failures down, and at this point I was genuinely considering just deleting the footage, giving up and just buying the bow fence extension. But then I really thought about the cost. £180 just for the fence, £54 for the supports, and a further £40 for the specialist clamps you need to attach it to your table saw fence. So £275 to not feel this frustration any longer. At that price, I needed one more try. And if I'm completely honest, do you know really why I needed one more try? Because I realised at the time if I didn't make videos, I would have given up. But I was convinced that if I could get this right, it would genuinely be helpful to any woodworker in my position. And to be even more brutally honest, at that stage, I really did need a win. So I went again. So this time, I replaced the 18mm ply with 12mm ply, shortened the whole design, and instead of just vertical braces, I realised I'd been quite dim when I hadn't realised that I'd never straightened the bend in the ply this way. So I cut 2 lengthways braces from 18mm ply. One to go flush along the bottom and then another at the exact height of the table saw fence. And this is important, and I'll show you why shortly. And to my honest relief, it came out perfectly. Well, not 100% perfect, but you know that start making 85% perfect that I've learned to accept. You see, in my haste to follow my new design, I'd selected some cheap ply with areas where the ply itself was not perfectly flat. So although the braces straighten out the curves, there were still some lumps and bumps. So I just did what any woodworker would do, and I hand-planed plywood. I know it's not pretty, but now it's as flat as I'm ever going to get it. So I'd finally completed my mission. But I still have to reiterate my first point. Although I've now succeeded in replicating this bow fence extension, it will never be as straight, as light, or as functional as just buying it. But you will be saving that £275 price tag. So that leaves me a lot of budget to spare, and mine may just do the same job. But before I could test it, I had to lighten the load with the support, attach it to the back using some threaded inserts and star knobs, and because I'm not finished with my experiments and wanted to add some more cool things to this, I drilled out some areas to attach the clamps where they would be nicely out of the way. Oh yes, and I'm calling this the Mark III table fence extension. Catchy. But now we need to test it. First test is one that they've all passed so far, the vertical square. Absolutely perfect. Let's get to the most important test. And please remember, when I made this, there was a significant gap created by the bump on the plywood, which made this look like it wasn't straight. With that bump itself playing down though, you can actually see that it is in fact pretty much straight. Straight enough for our needs. And now for the functionality test. Okay, so using my straight edge, I can see here that there's about a millimetre gap underneath. So actually when I come to feed a board in, the worry is that it might catch. With it only being a millimetre, I think I'm going to run this for a little while and see. See, it just gives you that little extra help. So by now I'd only have 1 inch of fence used. I've probably got a foot used at the moment, so the fence is going well. But more importantly, I've got support at the back where actually this piece would have fallen off already because there's still over half of it not on the table. So far so good. So let's have a quick mid-video conclusion if you like. If all you want is a fence extension that is made as cheaply as possible and that will do the job, this is it. But let me tell you about a pretty wild coincidence that happened midway through build number 2. And I promise, I'm not making this up. Halfway through build number 2, I was contacted by Banggood, a company out of China, and they asked very nicely if I'd like to test some of their tools. Now, none of you actually know this yet, but I've made a promise to myself that I'm not going to give full videos to review a single product. It's not something that goes down well on the channel. So after some thought, I replied and said exactly that. Thank you, but no thank you. But I genuinely thought that their guide rollers would really benefit this project. And so I just popped that at the end of the email. And so you'll understand I was a little bit surprised when they actually sent them through for me to test. And this is one of them. And let me show you how easy it is to fit them to this new design of fence. Luckily, as they arrived halfway through the second failed build, when I did the third, I put the middle brace at exactly the same height as the table saw fence, which in turn meant it was the right height to seat the rollers on. And what's exciting here is that I've never seen these nicely mounted on a contractor's table saw. I've seen people glue them to the fence and worse, but with this extension you just flush up one side and screw the track down. Now please note, it's not 100% perfect. It's the start making 85% that we've all come to accept. Unfortunately, you can only mount one track rather than the two, but the rollers still fit on either end of it and they are tight. You don't quite get the spread that you'd usually get, But one roller in front of the blade and one still after it is a definite improvement. But it's only good if it works. So let's quickly test it out. And then I can show you a couple more of the improvements that I've made. Pull backwards. Nothing. Nothing at all. Oh. It's worth noting that you can still pull the board away if you actually physically pull it that way. But if you're sliding it forwards, these are giving you a really good shove in the right direction. Now, I don't want to do a complete review of sorts, but you have to imagine that as the fence is designed for long rip cuts, these are the perfect companion for it. If you want to check them out, there's a link down in the description and you'll be helping the channel out. But very quickly, for anybody that's missed it, the fence was absolutely fine before these. And I know these are not a cheap accessory to add to it, but the bow fence was up at £275. And in order to do this job, you need to add 2 of the bow feather boards. That's another £66. So a total of £341. And when these Banggood rollers are only £120, the maths is still good. Once again, and I promise I'm not going to keep saying it, the bow extension does not need replacing for anything that is technically wrong with it. I'm just offering another solution. But now, let's do the bit I really love and whiz through all the final little tweaks that I've made and all the additions that I've added onto this. So for the first addition, I want to try and get a little bit more support on the opposite side of the blade to the fence itself. Mainly for when you've got wider boards that are also long. Now, for those people in the US with the larger cabinet style saws, Izzy Swan makes a brilliant extension that comes off the front of your saw for this exact purpose. But I couldn't see how that would work on a contractor's saw. So for this, I'm going to actually use the biggest strength of this setup, which is the workbench itself. And once again, do bear in mind that this is just going to be a prototype. And all it consists of is a well-braced small tabletop that attaches directly to the pillar of the workbench itself. You can permanently attach it if you want, or do what I do and use threaded inserts with star knobs. And yes, I spent way too long trying to level it with playing cards shims. It doesn't need to be perfect. Really, I think all it needs to be is a fraction higher than the table saw itself. And of course, route out a groove slightly wider than the one on your table saw so you can use larger sleds and jigs. This may actually be the area that this shines the most. And with that support in place, it's now time to turn our attention back to the Mark III fence extension. Now, from the start, I wrestled with the choice of whether this fence extension should be attached to the table saw fence and whether it should touch the top of the table saw or float above it. But in the end, I decided that if the extension itself was not to touch the table saw top, and was only to be attached to the fence of the table saw, that's a lot of pressure on the brackets due to the weight. But not doing that does leave friction as a bit of an issue. So here's my solution. Some skid blocks. My skid blocks are made from thin acrylic with the edges rounded smooth and attached with thin CA glue for uniform depth. And with friction still in mind, I was also inspired by a Hew and Awe video where Ben used the sort of plastic they use for chopping boards to make the side of his table saw fence. It's a brilliant video about refurbishing an old table saw. I'll pop you a link in the description. Now, I didn't have any of that plastic, but I did have some leftover laminate from my workbench top. Sadly, not one piece that was actually big enough, so there was a join, but it's still smooth enough not to snag on any of the boards. But after all my failures in this build, I've begun to doubt myself again. You see, I only tested this with a straight edge and a light. And as you saw, there was still light coming through. But what does that mean? So the final thing to do is to actually see scientifically if I've managed to make a fence extension that could genuinely save you £275. It's no bow fence extension, but if it's accurate, I'm happy. And this gauge will leave no doubt, straight or otherwise. It's a brilliant little purchase I made from AliExpress a while ago that I used to calibrate my fence and blade in my table saw. And it's not expensive. It's snug in the groove with no slop, and so I'm running it along my fence from start to end. You'll see any minor discrepancies in a move of the needle. And bear in mind, I've already ensured that the blade is parallel to the groove, so if the fence is parallel to the groove, then in turn it's parallel to the blade. As you saw there, we have 30 units of movement on the dial from start to finish of the fence. But what does that mean? That feels like a lot, so let's put it into perspective. This is a card scraper, and I know it is 0.8 millimeters thick. So as you can see, if I pop that between the fence and the reference needle, we gain 80 units around the dial. And so from that, all of a sudden the variance along the fence that was 30 units equates to 0.3 of a millimetre. I'll take that. I'm certainly not making another one of these based on it. Not for a long time, hopefully. And so a lot of work has gone into making this table saw extension. I really hope my mistakes work for you in two ways. One, to show you the best way to start and hopefully help you avoid the mistakes. But two, to show you that it is okay to just start making and see where you go. Because eventually you'll get there. Although if anybody can think of a use for really thin, really heavy shelf type cubbies, I've got two of these to use. And on a serious note, I'm very lucky to have companies like Hongdui reach out to me and say, here's something to try for free. And I'm not going to say that everybody out there should rush out and buy them. I also promise not to review them. Let's just say, if you see these in future videos, it means they're continuing to do a good job. Like any of the tools, there's links in the description if you want to check them out. And know that you'll be helping out a small channel along the way. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope there's something in here that you want to try and make for yourself. As I said at the start, I needed this win, and it wasn't a quick journey. If you're at a stage now where you want something quick to make before you crack on with this, there's some good wins in that video. If you've already seen it and you're looking for something else, YouTube's lined that one up for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you consider subscribing and clicking the like button, I would be incredibly grateful. If you click on another video, I'll see you over there. Thanks a lot.